This is Dystopian Writing, Lesson 9, and we're looking at third person narrative. When we're talking about first and third person narration, first or third person narrative, we're talking about really who is telling the story, through whose eyes are we seeing and experiencing events. With a first person narration, we are seeing events through the eyes of one character, through that character. It's that character who's experiencing events, and we just get to know the world of the story through the eyes and experiences of that one character. With a third person narration, we're not looking through the eyes of a character as such. We're more outside of the story. We're like a storyteller who's kind of looking in on the events and telling the story that way. And with third person, one way of looking at it, I mean, there are three main types of third person narration. We're going to look at two, but a good way of looking at a third person narrative is by looking at it as though the point of view is, or the storyteller is a bit like a camera in a film. So as I said, there are two main types. Well, there are three main types of third-person narrative. We're going to look at two in this lesson, and one of the types is third-person limited. So third-person limited is where it's a bit like first-person, but it's not that character who's telling the story. We are seeing, we're experiencing the world of the story through the eyes of that one character, but we're not limited to the experiences of that character, in the sense that a narrator outside of the story can still discuss things and share things with you and describe things that the character may not necessarily be thinking themselves. It's still another voice, and we'll look at an example in a minute. But one way of looking at it is to see a third person limited narration as a bit like a sort of tracking camera on a rail. If you imagine that camera is just behind one character all the way along, and we just follow that one character with that camera behind it all the way. That's a bit like third person limited. And as I say, we'll look at a good example of third person limited in a minute. The other type of third person narration that we're going to consider is third person omniscient. Omniscient means all knowing, all seeing. Okay, and one way of comparing it to third person limited is to see it a bit like a camera on a drone. A drone can go anywhere, can't it? Whereas in the previous image, the camera, remember we're sort of seeing the camera as the storyteller. In the previous image, the camera is limited to going up and down on those rails, whereas a camera on a drone can go anywhere, can't it? It can look at any angle, any perspective, any height, can just pretty much go anywhere. So one way of looking at a third person omniscient narration is by seeing it as a camera that's attached to a drone. But another way of looking at a third person omniscient is a bit like a kind of god. The narrator is a bit like a god. He knows everything, can see everything, can see through the eyes of any character, has that kind of godlike power of being able to go anywhere and know anything. All right. So I'm going to read an extract from George Orwell's 1984, an absolutely classic work of dystopian fiction. It's not the original work of dystopian fiction, but a highly influential one. It was actually published in 1948. So incredible influence this novel has had on dystopian writing, but it wasn't technically the first. Others went before it, but it's really important. So I'm going to read this to you. This is the opening, two paragraphs on the opening of the novel. Some of you may be familiar with it anyway, and I just want you to consider whether it's first person, third person limited, or third person omniscient. Here we go. It was a bright, cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. Winston Smith, his chin nuzzled into his breast, in an effort to escape the vile wind, slipped quickly through the glass doors of Victory Mansions, though not quickly enough to prevent a swirl of gritty dust from entering along with him. The hallway smelt of boiled cabbage and old rag mats. At one end of it, a coloured poster, too large for indoor display, had been tacked to the wall. It depicted simply an enormous face, more than a metre wide, the face of a man of about 45, with a heavy black moustache and ruggedly handsome features. Winston made for the stairs. It was no use trying the lift. Even at the best of times it was seldom working, and at present the electric current was cut off during daylight hours. It was part of the economy drive in preparation for Hate Week. The flat was 7 flights up, and Winston, who was 39 and had a varicose ulcer above his right ankle, went slowly, resting several times on the way. On each landing, opposite the lift shaft, the poster with the enormous face gazed from the wall. It was one of those pictures which are so contrived that the eyes follow you about when you move. Big Brother is watching you, the caption beneath it ran. Okay, so you may have realised that this, the narrative voice in 1984 is third person limited. There is a narrator who tells us things about the world that we're in and tells us about the attitude and thoughts and experiences of the main character, Winston Smith. But we mainly see things, in fact, I think we only see things through the eyes of Winston Smith. So, in some respects, it's quite like first person. And we're going to consider the sort of pros and cons, the advantages and disadvantages of third person limited with first person in a moment. Okay, before you begin to rewrite the 1984 extract as a first person narrative, which is what I'd like you to do. And the reason we're doing that is just to consider, the strengths and weaknesses, advantages and disadvantages, as I said, between first-person narrative and third-person limited. All right. So, because eventually, it's important that you understand that. So when you're reading text yourselves, you can perhaps it will give you some insight into the way the story's working if you're familiar with these two different narrative voices, and also it's an essential tool of any writer to be able to deploy either, depending on what you're trying to achieve. So we've got third person limited in 1984, and you're going to rewrite it as a first person narrative. So I've put 4 questions. There are other things that you could consider, but these are some things that you might want to consider before you rewrite it. So go back and look at the extract. I think we'll probably put a whole page of 1984 on the classroom, so you can also download it and have a look at it there. But let's have a think. So, question number 1: would he mention the clock striking 13? So, ask yourself whether Winston himself, if this was his own experience, whether he would tell you that, whether he needs to tell you that, whether he would mention that. Is this something that's usual? Is it something that's unusual? Would he put that in? Or if he does put it in, would he make a comment about it, or what would he say? Okay. Now 13, in some respects, is it's the 24-hour clock, so it's a bit of it's quite a striking opening, that, isn't it? It's very famous. Clock striking 13. It seems quite odd and strange and a bit unsettling, because 13 is a sort of unlucky number, isn't it? And clocks don't strike 13, so we know this world is a bit like our world because it's got clocks and it's similar to our world, but there's something different about it, isn't there? And the clock striking 13 indicates that it's like our world but different, because clocks don't strike 13, do they? But it's probably referencing the sort of 24-hour clock. So 13 would be 1300 hours, which would be 1 p.m, wouldn't it? Okay, but would he mention that? Would Winston Smith himself mention that? Secondly, would he mention the cold and how it is affecting him? As a character in the story, if it's his experience, would he talk about the cold? Would he talk about how he felt about it and what he did to keep warm? He might do. It's up to you to decide. And also to think about Would you add anything else? Again, some things to consider there. Number three, some smells in the building are mentioned. There's a mention of cabbage and there's a poster. Would he mention these also? And if he does, what would he say about them that might be different from the first person? Sorry, the third person narrator in the example. Not the example, the actual text itself. Okay, and fourthly, and these aren't the only questions, there are other things you can consider, but number four, would he mention his ulcer? So as a character in the story, would he mention that? Do we need to know that at this point in the story, do you think, as readers? And would he talk about how hard it is to climb up the stairs? Do we need to know these things if we're being introduced to Winston Smith? Okay, when he's introducing him, the world and himself to the reader. So some things to think about there. And anything else you want to add or change that you think would work to make this to make it work for you? You may put that in. So you've got to really think about here, haven't you? What are you trying to achieve in this opening? What do we need to know about? Okay, do we need to know? And what do we? And not only what do we need to know about, but how are we going to present it if it's from a character's perspective? Okay. All right. Finally, as a final task, write about a paragraph. Aim for about a paragraph. Just stop after you've now written the first person version of 1984. You're going to just consider, just to sort of tie up in your head, consolidate these thoughts, get them kind of stuck in there about the differences between the three different narratives. Now I haven't asked you to write a third person omniscient. It's what you have in front of you is quite similar to a third person omniscient, but as the story would develop, you might find that a third person omniscient can go into the minds of other characters as well, and so you might get a character. You might see the world through the eyes of another character, and that other character might be describing how their relationship with Winston Smith and how Winston Smith appears to them. You could do that, but I'm not going to ask you to write a third-person omniscient version of 1984, unless you feel you'd like to. If you want to have a go at it, by all means do so. But what I'd like you to do is just write a paragraph explaining the difference between first-person, third-person limited, and third-person omniscient. And as you're doing so, reflect upon how your own first-person version of 1984 differs from the third-person limited original. Okay, many thanks.